A cold November morning in Nashville, Tennessee. The kind of quiet that precedes something irreversible. Inside Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, correctional officers moved through familiar routines. Doors opened. Doors closed. The institution breathed the way it always did, but something was different that morning. Something that would expose a fracture at the very heart of America's death penalty system. Before we go further, if documentaries like this matter to you, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who needs to see it. Stories like this one deserve witnesses. Tony Carruthers had been on death row for over 2 decades. His crime was monstrous, in 1990 for murders of 3 people in Memphis, Tennessee. Courts had examined his case. Appeals had been exhausted. The state had set a date. By every official measure, the machinery of justice had run its course. All that remained was a scheduled procedure in a room. Most people will never see. Death by lethal injection, clinical, bureaucratic, carried out behind closed walls by the state of Tennessee. What happened inside that execution chamber, however, raised questions that officials were not prepared to answer publicly. Medical staff arrived. The protocol began. The inmate was prepared according to established procedure. Then something went wrong. Quietly, without announcement, the execution was halted. The stated reason was narrow and technical. Staff had been unable to establish a backup intravenous line, a secondary IV, a redundancy measure built into the protocol for exactly this kind of contingency. But the backup had failed, and so had the execution. Prison officials released a statement, short, measured, careful with its language. It confirmed the delay. It did not elaborate. It did not explain how long medical personnel had attempted the procedure. It did not explain what alternatives were considered. It did not explain who made the final call to stop. That silence was its own kind of testimony. In a system designed to operate with precision, the absence of a working vein had been enough to stop the process entirely. The question that immediately surfaced and that no official statement answered was not whether the execution had been delayed. That was already confirmed. The question was, how long had they tried before giving up? Witnesses were present in that chamber. Legal protocol requires it. Victim family representatives, media observers, state officials, people whose job it is to watch and record. What they observed that morning has been documented in fragments. Accounts that are consistent in their tension but incomplete in their detail. They watched. They waited. Something was happening on the other side of the glass that they could sense but not fully see. At some point, the curtain was drawn, or the process was suspended, or both. And then came the announcement that the execution would not proceed as scheduled. In a country where capital punishment is carried out by the state on behalf of its citizens, the mechanics of that process are rarely discussed openly. Most Americans have never seen the inside of an execution chamber. Most never will. But on that morning in Nashville, the machinery showed a crack. Something visible, however briefly, had broken through the surface of institutional silence. And somewhere in that silence between a failed for line and an official press release, there were questions that deserved answers. This is the story of what happened when the state tried to carry out the ultimate act of authority, and the body itself became an obstacle. To understand what happened inside that chamber, you have to understand the system that built it. America's relationship with capital punishment is long, contested, and deeply unresolved. The modern lethal injection protocol was introduced as a more humane alternative to earlier methods, cleaner, more clinical, less visible in its violence. The idea was that medicine could sanitize what law had authorized. Tennessee adopted lethal injection as its primary method of execution decades ago. The protocol was codified, reviewed, and revised over time. On paper, it reads like a medical procedure: a sedative, a paralytic agent, a drug to stop the heart. 3 drugs, 3 stages, each one dependent on the previous working correctly. And beneath all of it, the foreline, the physical connection between the state's authority and the body of the condemned. Without that line, nothing else in the protocol can function. Tony Carruthers was convicted in 1996 for the murders of Susan Burnett and her 2 children, Brian and Ashley, in Memphis. The details of the crime were brutal. A family destroyed, a community shattered, a case that generated exactly the kind of outrage that capital sentences are often born from. He was sentenced to death, He maintained a presence on Tennessee's death row for more than 25 years. During that time, the legal system moved around him in slow, deliberate cycles, appeals, stays, reviews, each one documented, each one eventually exhausted. By the time the execution date was formally scheduled, very few legal avenues remained open. Victim advocacy groups had waited years for this moment. For the Burnett family and those who loved them, the approaching date carried the weight of a promise made by the courts long ago. That weight does not disappear when an execution is delayed. It shifts. It becomes something heavier and harder to name. Inside Riverbend, execution protocols are rehearsed. Staff know their roles. The process is designed to eliminate uncertainty. The execution chamber itself is a small room and remarkable in its architecture, specific in its purpose. A gurney, restraints, monitoring equipment, the four apparatus, a window of reinforced glass through which witnesses observe. Everything in that room is deliberate. Nothing is accidental, or nothing is supposed to be. Medical professionals involved in executions occupy an uncomfortable position in American institutional life. Medical ethics codes, including those of the American Medical Association, explicitly prohibit physician participation in executions, and yet executions require medical competence. Someone must place the fork. Someone must monitor the sedation. Someone must confirm death. The people who perform these functions often do so anonymously. Their identities protected by state law. Their credentials and qualifications rarely disclosed to the public. When something goes wrong, as it did that morning, there is no named professional to question, no license board to review their conduct, no public accountability trail. This institutional invisibility is not accidental. It is designed. Tennessee, like most death penalty states, has shielded the identities of execution team members through confidentiality statutes. The reasoning given is security. The effect is opacity. When the backup IV line failed on Tony Carruthers, the questions that followed had no named individuals attached to them. No medical professional was identified. No official explained how many attempts had been made. No timeline was released. The state had encountered a significant procedural failure, and the response was to say as little as possible, as carefully as possible. In that careful silence, something important was being protected. Something beyond one inmate on one morning. The entire architecture of how executions are carried out in America depends, in part, on public distance from the details. What happened in that chamber had briefly closed that distance, and the institutions involved moved quickly to restore it. The question was whether they would succeed. There is a phrase that circulates quietly among death penalty observers and legal scholars. Botched execution. It is a clinical term for something that resists clinical description. A procedure gone wrong. A system revealing its own limits in the most consequential circumstances imaginable. The United States has a documented history of executions that did not proceed as intended. That history is longer than most people realize. The Death Penalty Information Center, a Washington-based organization that tracks capital punishment data, has documented dozens of cases where executions were prolonged, interrupted, or required multiple attempts. Cases where the IV line failed. Cases where the sedative appeared insufficient. Cases where witnesses reported visible distress in the condemned. Each case generated brief public attention. Each case was followed by official reassurances. Each case was eventually absorbed into the institutional record without systemic consequence. Tennessee itself had navigated execution controversies before the morning Tony Carruthers was brought to the chamber. The state had faced legal challenges over its lethal injection protocol. Courts had examined the three-drug combination used. Advocates had raised questions about whether the sedative reliably rendered the condemned unconscious before the subsequent drugs were administered. Those challenges had largely failed in court. The protocol had survived. The executions had continued, but each controversy had left a residue of a layer of unresolved questions sitting beneath the official reassurances. When medical staff were unable to establish a backup for line on the morning of Carruthers' scheduled execution, that residue became relevant again. Because the failure was not purely technical, it pointed to something structural. Execution teams in most American states are not composed of licensed physicians. They are often corrections officers with medical training, or contracted personnel whose qualifications are shielded from public scrutiny. The task of establishing a viable for-line routine in a hospital setting becomes considerably more complicated in a prison execution chamber on a person who may have compromised veins from years of incarceration, stress, or prior medical history. Former corrections officials, speaking to journalists over the years on background, have described the difficulty of for-placement in execution settings. Some inmates, they noted, had veins that were difficult to access. Some had histories of intravenous drug use that had damaged their vasculature. Some showed physiological stress responses, a constriction, elevated heart rate that made placement harder. None of this is exceptional medical knowledge. It is basic human physiology. And yet the protocols governing lethal injection executions were designed around an assumption of routine access, an assumption that the body would cooperate with the state's schedule. What the Carruthers case exposed, quietly but unmistakably, was the gap between protocol and reality. The backup for line, the redundancy measure, the failsafe had failed, which raised an immediate question that officials declined to address publicly. If the backup failed, what had happened with the primary line? Had it also presented difficulties? Had the primary placement taken longer than expected? Had there been attempts and failures before the backup was even attempted? The official statement said nothing about any of this. People who monitor executions professionally, journalists, legal observers, victim advocates reported that the delay between the scheduled start time and the announcement of postponement had been no table. Time had passed inside that chamber. Events had occurred, attempts had been made, and somewhere in the gap between what officials confirmed and what witnesses sensed, there were details that had not been disclosed. That gap mattered. Not abstractly, not philosophically. It mattered because the state of Tennessee had brought a man to the threshold of death, had encountered an obstacle it could not immediately overcome, and had chosen silence over transparency in explaining what had happened next. The victim's family had been present. They had waited. They had prepared themselves in whatever way a person prepares for such a moment, and then they had been told it would not happen today. What that experience costs a grieving family, already asked to carry the weight of a decades-long legal process, is not something any official statement can adequately address. And for those watching this case from the outside, one question was becoming impossible to ignore. If the state could not carry out this execution without incident, what exactly had been happening inside that room, and for how long? If this story is raising questions you haven't considered before, share it, subscribe, let someone else into this conversation, because what comes next changes everything we thought we understood about that morning. The postponement of an execution does not end the legal story. It opens a new chapter within it. When Tennessee officials halted the procedure, the state entered procedurally in certain territory. A scheduled execution had not been completed. The condemned man had been returned to his cell. The question of what happens next, legally, institutionally, humanly, is not one that existing protocols answer with any clarity. Death penalty law in the United States is a layered and often contradictory architecture. Federal constitutional protections sit above state statutes. Court precedents from decades of litigation create a framework that is simultaneously rigid and full of gaps. The Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment has been the primary legal battleground for lethal injection challenges. Courts have repeatedly been asked to determine whether a specific protocol, a specific combination of drugs, a specific procedure crosses the constitutional line. Most of the time, they have concluded that it does not. But the Carruthers postponement introduced a different dimension to that legal question. It was not a challenge to the drugs themselves. It was not a philosophical argument about the nature of capital punishment. It was a documented, state-confirmed failure of execution procedure. A failure that had occurred in real time, in front of witnesses, in a chamber built specifically to prevent exactly this kind of breakdown. That distinction mattered to the attorneys who were watching. Legal advocates monitoring death penalty cases across the country took note of what had happened in Nashville. The documented failure of N4 line and the state's subsequent silence. about the details provided potential grounds for renewed legal challenge. If the procedure had caused the condemned person undue distress, if the attempts to establish the fur had been prolonged or painful, or had involved repeated failures. That raised Eighth Amendment questions that courts would be obligated to consider. But pursuing those questions required information, specific information, timed, documented, witnessed information, and the state of Tennessee had disclosed almost none of it. Public records requests were filed. Legal teams sought documentation of what had occurred inside the chamber. The responses, where they came, were careful and limited. Information that might illuminate the timeline of events was withheld under correctional confidentiality provisions. The names of the medical personnel involved remained protected. The number of IV attempts was not confirmed. The duration of the procedure before postponement was not officially stated. The state had created a documentation wall around a publicly confirmed failure, and behind that wall, the details remained inaccessible. This is not unique to Tennessee. It is a pattern that legal scholars who study capital punishment have identified across multiple states. When executions go wrong, when something breaks the surface of the official narrative, the institutional response tends to follow a predictable shape. Confirm the minimum, explain nothing unnecessary, shield personnel, invoke security or confidentiality provisions, allow the story to fade. It is a strategy that has worked with reasonable consistency for decades. What makes the Carruthers case sit differently within that pattern is the nature of the failure itself. And for line is not an abstract element of protocol. It is a physical act performed on a human body by a person with specific skills and specific responsibilities. When that act fails, not once, but to the extent that a scheduled execution cannot proceed, the questions it generates are not procedural abstractions. They are questions about what was done, by whom, for how long, and what the person on that gurney experienced during the attempt. Those questions have not been answered publicly. They may never be answered publicly, but they exist. They are documented in the gap between what officials confirmed and what witnesses observed. And they point towards something that the American capital punishment system has never resolved cleanly: the fundamental tension between institutional authority and individual accountability. The state claims the right to end a life. That claim carries with it a corresponding obligation to carry out that act with precision, competence, and transparency. When the precision fails, the obligation does not disappear. It becomes more urgent. Tony Carruthers remained on death row. A new execution date would eventually be considered. The Burnett family remained in the exhausting position of waiting, again, for a resolution that had been promised and then deferred. And somewhere in the institutional machinery of Tennessee's corrections system, reports existed that described exactly what had happened in that chamber, reports that the public had not seen, reports that officials were working to ensure the public would not see. The question was whether that effort would hold. There is a person at the center of this story who has said very little publicly. Tony Carruthers has spent more than 2 decades inside the Tennessee corrections system. He has lived the slow rhythm of death row, the appeals, the dates, the reversals, the waiting. Whatever he experienced on the morning the execution was halted, he experienced it alone, in a room he had been brought to for a specific and final purpose. And then he was taken back to his cell. Death row in America is a specific psychological environment that researchers have studied for decades. The conditions vary by state and facility, but the common elements are documented isolation, limited movement, the psychological weight of an unresolved sentence that may be carried for years or decades. Riverbend Maximum Security Institution houses Tennessee's male death row population. It is a facility built for control and containment. The men who live there exist in a particular kind of suspended time. Their lives are defined by legal calendars they cannot control and institutional routines they cannot alter. What happens to a person psychologically when they are brought to an execution chamber prepared for death, and then returned to their cell? That is not a question that corrections officials typically address. Psychiatrists and psychologists who have worked with death row populations have written about the specific trauma of execution dates that do not proceed, the preparation, the goodbyes, the final meal, the physical experience of being restrained on a gurney, and then reversal, return, more waiting. Some researchers have described it as a form of psychological death followed by an involuntary return. The mind has processed an ending that the body then contradicts. The legal system does not formally recognize this experience as a harm. Courts have generally declined to treat the trauma of a failed or delayed execution as grounds for constitutional relief. The argument that a person can be brought to the threshold of death and returned without consequence illegally, institutionally, has been accepted by American courts with notable consistency, but the human reality of that experience does not disappear because courts decline to acknowledge it. Carruthers had direct legal representation through the Tennessee Public Defender System and associated capital defense teams. Those attorneys, whatever their views on their client's guilt, had professional and ethical obligations to pursue every available avenue of legal relief. The events of that morning failed for the postponement. The state's silence represented exactly the kind of documented procedural failure that capital defense teams are trained to pursue. Behind closed doors, legal strategies were being assembled. Arguments were being constructed around the gap between what the protocol required and what had actually occurred. The state's confidentiality wall was not impenetrable. It had edges, and experienced capital defense attorneys know how to find edges. Outside the legal proceedings, public reaction to the postponement followed a predictable and painful division. For those who opposed capital punishment, the failed execution was confirmation of what they had long argued, that the system was incapable of carrying out its own mandates without causing harm that it refused to acknowledge. For those who supported the sentence, and particularly for people connected to the Burnett family and the Memphis community that had lived with the aftermath of those murders, the postponement was experienced as something closer to cruelty directed at them. Survivors. Another delay, another deferral, another moment where the system had promised resolution and delivered waiting. Neither of those reactions exists in isolation from the other. Both are real. Both are grounded in genuine human experience. The weight of 3 murders, the documented failure of a state procedure, the family of victims asked to wait again, the legal questions about what happened inside a chamber that the state will not describe. These things coexist in the same story, and the discomfort of holding them simultaneously is part of what makes cases like this one so resistant to clean resolution. Investigative journalists who have covered Tennessee's death penalty system noted the broader context surrounding the Carruthers postponement. The state had been navigating execution-related legal challenges for years. Questions about its drug supply, its protocol revisions, its execution team qualifications had appeared in court filings and news reporting with increasing frequency. The morning that the backup IV line failed was not an isolated incident dropped into an otherwise and complicated institutional landscape. It was a visible fracture in a system that had been under pressure for a long time. And pressure, applied consistently enough, eventually finds the weakest point. In Tennessee, on that particular morning, the weakest point had turned out to be something almost unbearably specific: a vein, a needle, a line that could not be established. The entire weight of the state's authority, the decades of legal process, the court orders, the protocol documents, the witness arrangements had met a single point of human physical reality. And in that meeting, something had given way. The question of what that meant legally, morally, institutionally was far from settled. Some stories end with verdicts. Some end with sentences carried out. Some end in rooms that the public never sees, with details that officials have decided the public does not need to know. The story of what happened to Tony Carruthers on that November morning in Nashville has not ended cleanly. It has settled into the uncomfortable space that many capital punishment cases eventually occupy. Known in outline and resolved in detail, carried forward by the people it has marked. Tennessee officials rescheduled the execution. The legal process continued its slow, determined movement. The state maintained its position that the postponement was a procedural matter, that appropriate steps had been taken, that the protocol would be reviewed, and the process would proceed. No independent review of what had occurred inside the chamber was announced. No medical personnel were publicly identified or questioned. No timeline of the morning's events was officially released. The documentation wall held. For the Burnett family, the rescheduling brought a renewal of the exhausting emotional preparation that execution dates require. There is no guidebook for what survivors of violent crime are asked to endure through decades of capital litigation. The legal system promises resolution and delivers process. It promises finality and delivers continuance. The gap between those promises and that reality is where grieving families are asked to live, sometimes for the better part of their adult lives. That cost is real. It is documented in the accounts of victim advocates and grief counselors who work alongside families navigating the capital system, and it is rarely acknowledged in the official language of court orders and execution schedules. 4. Those who oppose capital punishment. The Carruthers postponement became a reference point in ongoing arguments about the system's fundamental reliability. The state cannot establish and for line without incident if the most basic mechanical requirement of the protocol can fail in a purpose-built chamber with a prepared team. Then what does that reveal about the broader infrastructure of state-sanctioned execution? That question does not have a simple answer. It was not designed to. It was designed to persist, to accumulate alongside other documented failures, to gradually build a record that courts and legislators and ultimately the public would eventually have to confront. The American death penalty system is contracting, slowly and evenly, with significant regional variation, but contracting. Fewer states carry out executions. Fewer juries return death sentences. Public support, while still present in polling, has shifted over decades in ways that correlate with increased awareness of wrongful convictions, racial disparities, and procedural failures. Tennessee sits within that larger national story, a state with an active death row, a history of execution controversies, and a public that is not unified in its views on what justice requires. The morning the needle failed was one data point within that larger story, small in the institutional record, significant in what it revealed. Tony Carruthers remains a man convicted of 3 murders. That fact has not changed. The courts that reviewed his case across more than 2 decades did not find grounds to overturn his conviction or his sentence. The victims of those murders, Susan Burnett and her children Brian and Ashley, remain gone. Their absence is the fixed point around which everything else in this story rotates. Whatever failures the system demonstrated that morning, whatever institutional secrecy followed, whatever legal arguments were constructed in the aftermath, none of it touches the reality of what was lost in Memphis in 1994. But the two things can be true simultaneously. The crime can be real and the system can be flawed. The sentence can be legal and the procedure can be unreliable. The state can have authority and still owe transparency about how it exercises that authority. These are not comfortable conclusions. They are not meant to be. The most honest thing that can be said about what happened inside that chamber is also the most unsatisfying. We do not fully know. The state has ensured that we do not fully know. And the people most affected by that uncertainty, the survivors, the condemned, the witnesses, have been left to carry it without explanation. That is where this story rests. Not at a verdict. Not at a resolution. At a door that was closed before the full account could be assembled. At a silence that was chosen rather than accidental. At a system that revealed its limits and then moved quickly to conceal the view. In the end, the most disturbing thing about what happened in Nashville that morning was not the mechanical failure itself. It was how little anyone in a position of authority felt obligated to explain. If this documentary has stayed with you, if these questions feel unfinished because they are, please subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave your thoughts below. Stories like this one survive because people refuse to look away. Thank you for watching.